Okay, welcome everyone. 2024 is the largest election year in history. And illicit money being funneled to political parties and to election campaign remains the largest threat to electoral integrity and represents unique corruption challenges. So in this panel, we are gathering together representatives from diverse perspectives, from government, public oversight agencies, civil society, both national and international, and media, to propose solutions for global action on enhanced political finance, transparency, and control. And the approaches proposed here will pave the way for the first ever UNCAC resolution on political finance to be tabled at the next UNCAC Conference of States Parties, the end of next year in Qatar. So we will first hear opening remarks from State Secretary Bjørg Sandkjær from the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Norway, and then I will engage with our panelists who will bring a wide range of experiences. We have Ritu Sarin, Executive Editor of News and Investigations at India Express and board member of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Megan Fitzgerald, Head of the Election Department for the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, or OSCE ODIHR. Lina Petroniene, Chairperson of the Central Election Commission here in Lithuania, and with a lot of experience in oversight of political finance issues. Yukihiko Hamada, Program Manager for Money and Politics at International IDEA. And Ketkandriana Rafitoson, Executive Director of Transparency International Madagascar and Vice Chair of the Board of Directors for Transparency International. Oh, and I'm Magnus Oman. I'm Director of the Regional Europe Office and Senior Global Political Finance Advisor at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, so IFES. Please, State Secretary Sandkjær.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here and talk about how we make sure that 2024 is really the super year of democracy, becomes just that, the super year of democracy, with populations of more than 70 countries globally going to the polls during this year. Now, may I ask how many people in the room have actually run for election? Well, we have a few. We have the experience. And won. Congratulations, sir. Very good. Anyone on the panel? Sorry, I forgot to, of course, yes. So we have people in the room with experience of campaigning and of what it takes to campaign. And we know that campaigning takes money. And there's nothing wrong with that, to receiving funding from maybe private donations, public subsidies, membership fees. It could be corporate, could be foreign, but could be illicit sources. So some of that funding, completely legitimate, some of it a bit more problematic, which is really what we are here to talk about today. How do we deal with those problematic sources of funding for campaigning, the problematic sources of funding for political parties, problematic sources of funding for everything associated with elections? Now, we know also that the driving force of corruption is undeniably the widespread use of secrecy. So moving ahead on addressing some of these issues could be around transparent reporting of political donations. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that in Norway a little bit later. Because we do know currently how unchecked political finance can empower dishonest actors. It can disadvantage less affluent candidates. It can unduly influence policy, manipulate resources, and in the end, eventually undermine democracy and perpetuate inequality. So what we are really looking for is fairness, transparency, and accountability in political finance. So important for electoral integrity and preventing corruption and state capture. We also have solid reports telling us that robust safeguards, unfortunately, is lacking in many countries, including in some of what we call the advanced democracies. In 10 of more than the 70 countries that have elections this year, voters unfortunately know little about who sponsors the candidates. The Electoral Integrity Global Report 2023 ranks campaign finance as the weakest area of electoral integrity worldwide. Now, reasonable limits on donations and expenditures can make elections more competitive, can constrain incumbents' advantages, and preserve political equality. Fair access to funding also promotes gender equality in politics, but opaque and gender-blind political finance regulations can result in a tilted playing field, creating barriers for women's participation in politics. And finally, let me also mention that emerging evidence indicates that disproportionate financial influence in politics can skew policies in ways that hinders societal qualities. And again, all political parties do need funding to play their part in the political process. But a regulatory framework for party finance should contribute to good democratic processes. So I said that I would mention a bit about how we do it in Norway. We have reports that give us reasonably good feedback, saying that we have a fairly robust and transparent system for electoral financing, especially around transparency and accountability. Now, that system didn't come about overnight. It has been developed over decades, with strong involvement, actually, from the political parties themselves. And the current framework in Norway stems from the 2005 called Political Party Act. So political parties in Norway are funded in several ways. We can receive public grants, we can have income from gifts or donations or even property. The key is that pursuant to the Political Parties Act, all parties and party units are obliged to disclose information regarding party accounts as well as donors. And all of this information is available on a dedicated public website. So when I ran for election in 2021, and we received donations from a few wealthy individuals, all of that had to be disclosed. It was put in real time on a website. You can actually have a look at it. It's in Norwegian, but it may be interesting to see what it looks like. The Norwegian name is partifinansiering, party financing. Actually, if you come see me afterwards, I'll tell you how to spell it. You may want to look it up while we're here talking. But partifinancing.no, but in Norwegian. It's very easily accessible. It's a logical name, so it's easy to find it if you Google it in Norwegian. It's very easy to navigate once you find it, and you will be able to click on any party and see who has given donations. You will also be able to access the different parties' accounts and other information about the party. So it's all very transparent, and that's something also that the parties have worked together to agree on. This is how we actually want to do it. And I would just like to mention 5 main considerations that are safeguarded in that political finance framework. First, to preserve trust in politicians and political institutions. Those rules that we have should, as far as possible, deter corruption-like behavior and abuse. And of course, I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room how important trust is, really at the core of our democracies. The second consideration is to enable parties to perform their core tasks. Tasks such as formulating comprehensive political programs or setting up lists for elections, ensuring recruitment and training of political leaders, and contributing to the public discourse. A third consideration is that it should not contribute to unjustified distortion of competition. So we apply the principle of one person, one vote. Fourth consideration is to ensure the autonomy of the parties. So parties should be securely anchored in civil society and have a significant degree of autonomy. Neither the authorities nor private interests should dictate a party. So I can tell you every election when donations are disclosed, there will be discussions around the interests of some of the donors to donate to some of the parties. But it's all disclosed, it's all public, and it's all open. So on my list of considerations, the fifth one, to support the internal democracy of the parties. I think in a well-functioning democracy, those who wish to participate in shaping decisions that concern them should also be given that opportunity. So those considerations lie really at the basis of how we've been thinking around electoral and party financing in the Norwegian context. The OECD Public Integrity Indicators and a recent study from IDEA overall assess the Norwegian party financing regime quite positively. But of course, no system is perfect, and we are also not complacent with what we have. We believe international standards can be a powerful catalyst for domestic change by providing a blueprint for reform for domestic actors to adapt and advocate, as well as a benchmarking tool for national and international stakeholders who engage in election observation missions and peer-to-peer review mechanisms. So I talked a bit now about how we do things in Norway. I'd like to change now to talk a little bit about our contributions towards global standards in political finance. And I look forward to hearing also the panel's feedback on how we set those global standards the best possible way. And a very important partner in this is, of course, the media. So after numerous leaks and revelations from the media, particularly, I'd like to mention the excellent work of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which disclosed corruption involving high-level politicians, private sector, law firms, and other enablers. Norway took the initiative at the State Party Conference of the UN Convention Against Corruption back in 2017, the COSP11. And Norway furthermore spearheaded the negotiations on Resolution 7.2, corruption involving vast quantities of assets. So that resolution was followed up under the leadership and in cooperation with UNODC, with expert meetings. Some of you may have been there, Lima, Prague, and Oslo. And the latter delivered an outcome document called the Oslo Statement, which was adopted in 2019. The Prague expert group meeting was crucial as it formulated a set of principles on political finance transparency, including on reporting, disclosure, sources of income, expenditure, oversight, and sanctions. So this set of principles really remains the backbone of efforts by international organizations to promote international standards. The Oslo Statement on corruption involving vast quantities of assets contains several key recommendations on political finance transparency, and I'll mention three. The first is strengthening oversight agencies mandated with enforcing political finance regulations. The second, enabling civil society and media oversight of political finance. And third, addressing the links between political finance, state capture, foreign interference, and organized crime. The role of money in politics is arguably one of the biggest threats to democracy today. It could be huge corporate campaign donations, could be drug money seeping into politics, could be corruption scandals. Research from the US shows that more than 2/3 of the population trusts the government less because of big donor influence. So, ladies and gentlemen, based on our own experience, I'd like to wrap up by highlighting 4 concrete actions that we think are needed to ensure and advance political finance integrity. The first is for governments to regulate political donations and expenditures effectively. Second, that there must be full transparency and disclosure of donations with penalties for non-compliance. Third, that there must be effective monitoring and enforcement of regulations. And finally, that it is crucial to have the political will to not only design, but also to enforce these measures. We are aware of discussions related to a possible UN resolution on the topic of political financing, and we're looking forward to monitoring this process closely as we move to the next UNCAC Conference of States Parties to take place in Qatar. And we invite also people in this room to take part in those discussions as we set our sights on that meeting. So thank you very much. Look forward to hearing the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Secretary Sancher. I do remember the Prague meeting very well that led to the Oslo statement. Let us now turn to our panelists. And first, I want us to together set the scene regarding the financing of political parties and election campaigns. And Yukiko Hamada, I'll ask the first question to you. In almost all democratic countries, in most countries that are not democratic as well, there are at least some rules on political finance. But we still hear about scandals fairly often. So why aren't the rules working?
Thanks, Magnus. And it's very hard to add anything substantial after the excellent opening remarks from the State Secretary. But if I may, take a shot at your question. I think there are a few reasons for the regulations not working in many countries. According to International Ideas Research, at least 181 countries in the world have some sort of political finance laws in place already. However, as we all know, and then we've heard over and again at this conference as well, I mean, political finance scandals are everywhere. The number one reason for that is that simply legislative shortcomings and loopholes in political finance regulations continue to exist in many countries. Donations from anonymous sources, foreign sources, or shell companies or third parties, for example, those are the very typical risk factors that need to be more strictly regulated. And of course, there's an element of political finance transparency as well. While most political parties and candidates in most countries are required to submit financial reports to oversight agency, still, most of those practices is on paper basis, and the example we just heard from Norway is fantastic. I would consider it a gold standard, but in this digital age, it is still not the norm in most countries, I have to say. And then also, let us not forget the political finance landscape and socio-economic environment evolving and changing very rapidly. Globalization, digitalization that we face today has a huge implications for anti-corruption and political finance. For example, many political finance laws in especially Western democracies were drafted years before when social media was part of the political parties' campaign tools, for example. So it's incredibly important to ensure that existing regulations are constantly reviewed and make up to date against the emerging challenges. And not last but not least, the other problem is, of course, the issue of implementation. I'm sure our colleague Lina has a lot to say about this as the head of the oversight agency. But in many countries, we do see problems that oversight agencies are lacking sufficient legal mandate, resources to conduct meaningful oversight. All of those things will impact on the implementation level of existing regulations. And in order to address all those problems that I just mentioned, I also think that the existing global standard or regional standard on political finance are currently very lax, and it's about time that we revisit and then also improve the global standard which is fit for purpose for today's anti-corruption world. I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yukiko. Megan Fitzgerald, let me ask you, the OSCE order conducts electoral observation across most, if not all, of the OSCE region. What are the most common problems in the regulation and practice of political finance that you find as part of that observation?
Thank you, and thanks for inviting to contribute to this discussion. I do think the State Secretary really did set the scene, and I'm struck by how what I'm about to say reiterates, from our observations, reiterates some of the findings of the research from my colleague from my International IDEA. The OSCE's, or Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, does conduct at least a needs assessment in all national elections in all but one of the 57 OSCE participating states, and the exception being the Holy See. But otherwise, we do reports on the election processes in all other 56 states. What we find is most common, based on our observation, is a problem of what the regulation does not capture, so under-regulation. If we look at regulation of campaign finance as mainly aimed at providing equal opportunities and preventing undue influences, a level playing field is not ensured where there are gaps. And when we identify and see that the regulation isn't applied to the entire campaign process or entire all campaign activities, then this goal isn't achieved. We noted under regulation, even as recently as our report on the European parliamentary elections, as a problem that was faced across EU member states as well. The under-regulation can also often be because of a lot of campaigning taking place outside of the official campaign periods. And this is in particular when the campaign period is particularly short. Or that the regulation doesn't cover key campaign activities, such as campaigning online or third-party campaigning. Often we are seeing that OSCE participating states have not sufficiently explicitly regulated in their laws. Also quite common in what we observe and reiterates as well is the lack of timely reporting and auditing of the reports. Again, if we look at the aim of providing an equal opportunity, then the oversight needs to be effective, and meaning the reports need to be required and reviewed in a timely manner, and the violations need to be promptly addressed. All this also takes the political will that the State Secretary mentioned, and I think is very necessary and definitely crucial to where we're seeing problems being faced.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me turn to Katarina Refitoson. Civil society plays an important role, it's already been mentioned in the setup, in monitoring political finance and holding political actors accountable, and then complementing the role of public oversight institutions that we'll turn to in a second. In your experience, what are the main gaps that you've seen in making political finance information transparent and accessible to the public?
So first of all, hello everyone. And then to answer a question, the main obstacle or gap is the lack of information. That's the first thing. Because when you want to monitor political finance data, if this data is not available, then it is very hard to monitor them, and it is very hard to make them public. And in the numerous countries where we are working and trying to implement political integrity through transparency of political finance data, this is always the main problem. So it comes for sure from political parties because they don't want to disclose their financial information. But at the same time, it also comes from the government or the state when the mechanisms or regulations are missing. So it joins what the previous speakers have just mentioned, you know, when regulations are not into place, when the culture of transparency as well and accountability is not prevailing and the culture of secrecy is dominating, it is very hard for civil society, even with the best intention of the world, to really make those things public. So therefore, there is a need for educating, I would say, at the same time, the political parties, but also governments, and also the citizens themselves to demand better and demand more clarity and demand more transparency from politicians and also from rulers. Because if we don't have this, I would say, citizen demand, that would be also hard for civil society to leverage for all of the reforms on the regulatory side, but also to put into place those mechanisms. Nonetheless, we have great examples of success in Colombia, for instance, where starting from scratch, there was the initiative of Cuentas Claras, which worked, and that was leveraged by civil society. And at the end of the day, the government agreed to play the game also with the political parties. And that joins the example of Norway that you gave. It needs the political will, not only from those who are in power, but all of the cohort of political parties to engage into this transparency game. So the will is also missing where it's not working. And I would say also that, of course, the lack of access to information is joining the lack of data, of available data. When you don't have a law guaranteeing the universal access to information, then you don't have also this leverage for putting pressure on political parties and the government and saying, give us that information. Every citizen, every voter has the right to know. We all know that. Where does the money come from during the campaign? We have the right to know, but if the legal framework for this right to know and the right to inform as well doesn't even exist, it's very difficult, to make things happen.
Thank you very much. Lina Petroniene, so when there are these gaps in the legal framework and so on, all those challenges end up on your desk. And as State Secretary Sanchez noted, political finance is consistently ranked as the weakest link in the electoral integrity chain. Please share with us some of the key political finance breaches that you've observed in your work and what impact that these breaches may have on democracy and development.
Yeah, the most often and the low impact breaches are very technical. Just respecting deadlines for registering donations, expenditure, submitting reports, but it's very low impact. More serious breaches are during every political campaign. It occurs that we have situations when expenditures are not declared or part of expenditures, and it means that it can be only mistake. We forget to declare some expenditures, or it can be illegal financing behind the undeclared expenditures. And CEC checks every time if you find undeclared expenditures, if it is paid, and if it is paid from legal or illegal sources. Also, there are even more important, we have illegal financing. It can be by, I don't know, maybe some person has no right to donate, or he is exceeding his limits, or it can be given like services, and for free, or even paid for by third parties. And it depends how complicated schemes are. It's very complicated to find these breaches. But in CEC, we try to do it, and we try to check all reports. That is why very important to declare not only donations and to check only donations, but to check expenditures, because behind the expenditures you can find illegal financing. Also, of course, bribe of voters, I don't know, administrative resources, other kind of influences. And what is bad with it? That winning candidates, we can feel that we have to work to their donors, for their real donors, not for voters, but for their real donors. And it really damages the integrity of electoral process. because voters, we don't trust in candidates who won by illegal funding, by some illegal influence to voters.
Thank you very much. Sarin, let's look at the journalist perspective. Based on your work as a journalist, what connections do you draw between political finance and corruption? This is the ICC, after all. What are interesting cases you can highlight, including from the recent elections in India?
Yeah, thank you all for being here. And since the figures were so daunting in India, especially speaking at such a small country like we are, our host country, I put them on the screen. And the elections in India are just over. In fact, the results came on the 4th, and we have a coalition government now in place. So here are some large figures. Look at the number of voters and number of parties that participated, 750. Voters per polling booth is 1,500, number of polling booths. Turnout was 65%. That's just for background. Now, here's what's important in view of the subject that we are at hand. The Election Commission sort of had a record seizure of cash during this election, and the polling went on for 6 weeks, and the figure is there, 1.1 billion euros was seized by the Election Commission in various modes. And of course, it's just the tip of the iceberg. This is what they seized. Along with that, drugs were seized, valued at 489 million euros during the election campaign by the Election Commission. So I just thought, since the election is just over, these figures may be of interest. The other thing, of course, is the electoral bonds. Yeah. So the electoral bonds is there's something. It's an instrument for funding elections, candidates and parties in India, and the scheme had been running for 6 years. Just about a month before India went to polls, the Supreme Court declared the electoral bonds unconstitutional and threw the whole scheme out of the window. So now we are at a stage in India with the bonds gone. We don't know how election funding is going to be done. Of course, it's something the government is already talking about. The new government is starting to talk about a new scheme. But the point is, will there be return to black money? And what the electoral bonds showed was this, because Supreme Court also ordered the matching of the people who gave the bonds and the parties. And what it showed was this: 48% of all the bonds that were purchased in India since 5 years were for the ruling party, that is the Bharatiya Janata Party. 48%. These are some of the stories I had done for the Indian Express on the bonds. And here are some more stories. 11% went to the principal principal opposition party, that is the Congress. And 13% went to another opposition party, the Trinamool Congress. I had done a story, I remember, on how 5 days before the Supreme Court gave its ruling, the government ordered the printing of electoral bonds totaling 10,000 crores. So what does that mean? Half of that would have gone to the ruling party if those bonds had been printed and distributed.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so that's a good illustration of the issues that we are discussing here on general terms. Let's move now to the issue of common standards in political finance oversight, which we already heard about in the opening statement. Okay, let me ask you first, from a civil society perspective, what kinds of initiatives would you say are being taken by civil society at the global, at the regional, at the national levels to make sure that political parties and political actors in general are transparent and accountable in relation to the flow of money in elections?
So the first thing is to remind, political players and also governments about the engagements, the international engagements that they have been taking through the UNCAC. For instance, there is a provision 7.3, asking for all state parties to take measures for ensuring the transparency of those political funding. So all states, almost all state parties are missing the crucial links, and measures for implementing this. So this is the first reminder. In Africa, we also have the African Union Convention on these matters, on anti-corruption, and also we have the ACDEC, the African Convention on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, which all commend, transparency in political funding. And I wanted to quote, the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, because the wording is much more, I won't say aggressive, but stronger. Maybe the language is stronger than the UNCAC. It says, each state party shall adopt legislative and other measures to proscribe the use of funds acquired through illegal and corrupt practices to finance political parties, and incorporate the principle of transparency into funding of political parties. I like the way proscribe and also illegal and corrupt practices, but this is very good on paper. I can assure you that there is no implementation at all of this provision, unfortunately. So this legal remainder, this joint and constant advocacy is the first thing done by civil society, nationally and regionally. Second thing is investigations, as has been just, exposed. In Madagascar, for instance, we have our own unit of investigative journalism aiming to expose grand corruption, and we are doing a lot of work around political finance. And people don't like it. I mean, people from the political side, of course, because we are playing with their stories. But the public is in demand of such clarity and clarification. And there are lots of initiatives like this in investigative journalism around the world. Now, speaking about Transparency International specifically, we are now running a project named CME, Clean Money in Elections. So the name already tells everything. With the help of Global Affairs Canada, we are very, very thankful for this support. And, so this project is running in Zambia, Panama, Venezuela, Madagascar, and Colombia, Indonesia. What we want to achieve is really to create a kind of platform where all the data, the big dream would be to have like your accessibility and flow of information in all of these countries. So Norway is one of the top models for us, but some countries are more advanced than others, and so the effort for CSOs is to collaborate, to exchange best practices, and to build together also this culture of transparency. And of course, pushing for this culture of transparency also implies a big work on site, on the grassroots level, because you have at the same time to educate the voters. Don't vote for those who have big money and you don't know where this big money comes from. You'd better vote from people with clarity and transparency, those with ideas. So campaigns like this are also crucial, to make the voters in contribution to this global effort. But once again, I will reiterate that as long as we are not conscious that we need to restrain this flow of illicit finance at the very global level, that would be difficult at the national level to push for those efforts. So it has to be a priority, and I'm totally buying the idea of updating the global conventions that we have today, and to look a little bit also at the priorities that we can have, and whistleblowers protection is among these, because those, including investigative journalists and CSOs and activists who know the political information and disclose this, they are the one targeted afterwards by retaliation from political parties and governments. And this is totally unfair, because what civil society, what journalists are doing is informing. It is not a crime, and it is not nor a crime to fight against corruption, political corruption.
Thank you very much. And like you mentioned UNCAC Article 7.3, I'd like to point out that it says very clearly that all state parties have to think about introducing rules for transparency. They don't actually have to do it. So a bit of additional guidance might help. Megan, we talked about the election observation that ODIHR does, but apart from that, ODIHR also supports authorities in improving electoral processes, following up on recommendations on ODIHR election observation issues, on things such as political finance. In providing that support, which global standards relating to political finance do you find to be the most valuable, and which areas would benefit from stronger or updated standards?
Thanks. In some ways, I actually think the principles and standards, or in the case of OSCE countries, the political commitments that are most valuable are also the ones that need further development. I think we've already touched on the principle of transparency, and I would argue, although that's aspirationally written in the UNCAC that you mentioned, I would argue that the principle of transparency underlines all public functions, and we can still hold both contestants and oversight bodies and those administering elections to that standard of transparency. We also use and make reference often in ODIHR work to the voter's ability to make an informed choice. And that's very valuable for us to explain to countries why they have to be more open and more transparent about campaign finances and where the money is coming from. Because the right to vote, it's not just the right to put a piece of paper in the ballot box, as you all know, but it also entails the right to be able to know who you're voting for and who's supporting those, who's influencing their decision-making abilities. And if the transparency is there, then voters will also contribute to holding them accountable in how they used the money and what money they used and took about. Another area that we really feel needs further elaboration at the national level and international level is addressing the abuse of state resources, the misuse of state resources, or public position or public office. You see this even in well-developed democracies, and it stems there from a lack of understanding of what is it and where do you draw the line? What does it mean to misuse administrative resources? And similarly, it's a problem for the oversight bodies on how do you enforce it? How do you determine whether or not it was a misuse? So further efforts to clearly define it and set a standard for what should not be used in campaigns, and then to educate those participating in campaigns or overseeing campaigns on enforcing it. Finally, I would just say we have some good guiding principles on democratic lawmaking, and because you mentioned our assistance on the lawmaking side of things, and there's where we can really call on those principles, and we have concrete commitments that they must be inclusive processes, and there's how we can force or encourage states to include civil society and other actors in the lawmaking process and reform process.
Thank you, Megan. Rito, back to the media perspective. What role can media play as a watchdog of election campaign finance and in holding political actors accountable? And if you can highlight some recent examples of how media has uncovered political finance scandals.
Okay, maybe two examples. One, of course, is the body of work done as the Secretary mentioned, by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And in the sense, the electoral bonds disclosure makes very clear that it is the corporates who have been funding the political parties and funding the political parties more generously which are in power. And when these disclosures came out just a month ago, we've noticed and we've published streams and examples of quid pro quo companies which are in the snare of investigating agencies are subsequently, the cases go slow. That's one. And otherwise, they can get benefits like, fast tracking of, could be finance, could be licenses, could be anything. So this whole issue of the quid pro quo exposed by the electoral bond disclosures is now a matter in court. The elections came as an interregnum. The elections interrupted all that, but the Supreme Court of India is yet to hear the issue of quid pro quo. So that will subsequently play out. And in the same connection, I remember the Indian Express just before elections, we had done an exhaustive investigation into what in India is called the washing machine syndrome. People from other political parties join another party, in this, of course, case, the BJP and the ruling party, and lo and behold, the cases, taper off, or nothing is heard, or there are no charge sheets. So we had just recently done an investigation to show how out of 25 leaders who switched to the BJP, 23, the cases went slow, by the Central Bureau of Investigation or the Enforcement Directorate or something like that. So, yeah, washing machine and the body of work done by ICIJ, I think, is contributing to this kind of transparency gradually coming in, though we need to see in India what will replace electoral bonds.
Thank you very much. Lina, do we have washing machines in Lithuania? From the perspective of oversight agencies, are there areas in political finance that you feel need to be addressed by strengthening existing global standards?
Usually standards pay more attention to disclosing funding, but I think it's very important to speak about disclosing advertising, expenditure, even contracts. In Lithuania, we publish even text of contracts made during political campaign. It's very important. Also, it's very important not to forget about annual activity of political parties, because activity between political campaigns is also a part of political campaign. It can impact also expenditure for political campaign. And some legal regulations. Some countries, we struggle with, observing online campaigning, because it's not written in the law. So the law should not be constructed in this way, but if it is unwritten some new campaigning, you don't see it. No, you have to see everything about political campaign, and the law should allow it to do it. Also, the mandate of institution who controls over financing, because sometimes there are countries which have very weak mandate. And in Lithuania, it's very important that we have a quite strong mandate, and we have, in the law, it is written about using information technologies. It helps us, because if you have a lot of information on paper, I cannot imagine even in Lithuania, which is quite small country, control based on paper. Only information technologies, all information digitalized help us. So it's very important to speak about this in standards also.
Thank you, Lina. Yuki, let's turn to you. From the perspective of an intergovernmental organization like International IDEA, how do you see the role of global standards on political finance, such as UNCAC we've been talking about, and how should they be further strengthened?
Thanks. Right, so global standards and regional tools on political finance are a really important piece of toolkit for any international organizations, I believe, including ourselves, International IDEA. When we provide data and technical advice to oversight agencies in our member states and so forth, such global standards are really the tools to provide us the benchmark, what's the minimum standard to adhere to. So in that regard, certainly although there are certain criticisms out there always that we have already too many principles or too many recommendations and so forth, but I still think global standards are actually very, very useful tools for policymakers and for politicians. But having said that, when it comes to political finance global standard, unfortunately, all we have is UNCAC at the moment, UN Convention Against Corruption. And as also Kerr and all the other panelists also alluded in their remarks, it's only one article, Article 7.3, very casually talks about the value of political finance transparency, but it's really not strong enough nor or binding. So, but then having said that, I mean, how political finance is being really widely spoken about and then talked about at this conference or also anywhere else in any anti-corruption community lately, I really think it's about time that we reprioritize the political finance as one of the key issues in anti-corruption world, and collectively anti-corruption community will tackle about this. Then when we think about how to update these global standards, there are a few things that I definitely like to see this new updated guidelines or global standard will speak about. There are a couple of them. First of all, beyond political finance transparency, I certainly like to see a little bit more strong language about more specific measures, how to mitigate the risks of money in politics, be it banning certain type of donation sources or placing some sort of numerical caps on donations or expenditure, but some sort of more specific, more concrete languages and how to go about mitigating a risk of money in politics. I think that's very important first step. And then also in this age, in this open government partnership age we live in, I definitely think it's not unfair to imagine or introduce certain condition that some political finance data should be reported digitally in an open and transparent and timely manner. And then, of course, some guidance about how to empower oversight agencies in order to ensure their independence and make sure that they have enough resources and manpower to conduct meaningful resources. And then last not least, I definitely like to see the updated guidelines to talk about promoting stakeholder engagement and promoting interagency cooperation. Many of the political finance challenges that we face today, especially newer challenges, for example, social media, we touched upon a little bit, those issues often fall under the multiple agencies' responsibilities, and they're not always solely a mandate of electoral management body or political finance agencies. So this cooperation among government agencies and also whole of society approach that regulators will work with civil society, media, international organizations, and other academics. I mean, that level of cooperation is a key to more successful political finance regulations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuki. And so then let's move to the final round in our discussion, focusing on what needs to be done for the future. And I will ask pretty much the same question to each of you, and asking, of course, your responses from the each perspective in the work that you are doing. And let me first ask you, Rita, from your perspective, what concrete action needs to be taken, and by whom, to advance effective measures to ensure integrity and political finance? And the second part is, what opportunities do you see for collaboration between stakeholders across sectors, such as the ones represented here in the panel?
Probably two things. One is, in India, I see the whole procedure of declaration of assets is very perfunctory, you know, it is more of a formality than everything else. So that somehow needs to be strengthened, guidelines need to be streamlined, and declaration of assets, they are not updated. If there's a complaint of violation or of undervaluation by a competitive candidate in an election, which has just happened, there's a complaint in the Election Commission, but the results are seen maybe years later, you know, by the time everything is forgotten. So that perfunctoriness of declaration of assets needs to be spread out to even constitutional bodies in India, and not just candidates who are fighting for elections. That's one. And two, you know, state agencies, I mentioned the Enforcement Directorate and the Central Bureau of Investigation, they need to be insulated from influencing the, you know, not the process of elections, but maybe the atmosphere of elections. I'll give you two examples. Again, in this recently concluded election, you have the top two leaders of the Delhi government, the Chief Minister and the Deputy Chief Minister, in jail. They are in prison right now. They allowed the Chief Minister, Mr. Kejriwal, to come out and campaign for 2-3 weeks, but he's back in prison. One of the allegations against him is, small is maybe not the right word, but a relatively small matter of corruption in a liquor policy that he introduced. And the allegation also is that that money was used for buying votes in an assembly election in the Goa state. That's one of the grounds on which he has been put behind bars just before elections. And the Congress party, which is the main opposition party, has had its entire funds and bank accounts frozen on the eve of elections, and some of these are for violations that the party allegedly committed a decade ago. Decade ago, violations committed, their accounts frozen just prior to the election. How are they going to fight the election? So, somehow these agencies there have to be some guidelines for these agencies to, at least in the pre-election season, not be allowed to arrest, freeze accounts, and things like that.
Thank you very much. Megan, same question to you, really. What do you see as the key actions that need to be taken, and what are the main opportunities for collaboration between stakeholders?
Yeah, to be concrete and brief so we can get to some questions, I would say the number one key thing that needs to be done is to fully enable oversight bodies. Oversight bodies, at least in the OSCE region, normally do exist in some form or another. Sometimes it's a government role, but they exist, but they are almost always not fully capacitated to manage the review and monitoring of campaign finances. They're not adequately resourced or staffed and mandated. And where they are fully mandated and adequately resourced, then there's often compromises to their independence or impartiality. Then they're overreaching their capacity and their role in that regards. But where they are properly independent and impartial, they almost always don't have enough resources to do the monitoring. And where we can cooperate, I would just repeat my previous recommendation about on the reforms, when reviewing the legislation on campaign finance, we can cooperate there.
Thank you very much again. Lina, Megan is saying that there are challenges with oversight institutions. You're the head of an oversight institution. What do you see as key actions that need to be taken and the opportunities for collaboration?
Okay, I think prevention and control are two key elements. Prevention, it means that we have to create conditions to follow the rules. We have to train candidates, political parties. Also, we have to help them to follow the rules, because in Lithuania you need some specific information if you can accept a donation or not. So we give this information to them, and we can take a decision. Another control, we have to check all reports, and we have to think about other information, not only information in the report, but about other information we can access. In Lithuania, we get information from media, from monitoring groups. Also, we use as libraries, which are public available, because we have to combine different information to analyze it. It's very important. And about collaboration, yeah, I think every time it's very important, and we have a lot of real examples when recommendations of OSCE helped us to introduce in Lithuania membership fees limits, because when you go to parliament, you speak from your own experience. Not every time we believe you, but when you have recommendations from international institutions, we hear you better. So I think it's the main point of collaboration, and also the dialogue with bigger players like social media. One institution, there is no way to speak with Facebook, for example. But when we have international network, it's much easier.
Thank you very much, Lina. Yuki, key activities needed, key openings for collaboration.
Right. So yes, I have very two brief points to highlight here. So on concrete next steps, particularly for more strengthened global standard on political finance, first and foremost, I definitely like to urge more government officials and UNCAC signatories to consider proposing a new resolution on political finance at the next COSP meeting in Doha 2025. It was so encouraging to hear from the State Secretary of Norway that very pro-reform and pro-transparency in this matter. But we certainly need more allies, more other government members joining forces in this movement. So definitely that's my biggest wish and takeaway from this panel. But as for what we, for example, international organizations like IDEA can do to contribute to this area and how we can collaborate with all the area of society and then some of you in the participants, is that possibly one key element is data and evidence. Certainly, all this discussion at global level and national level has to be guided by data and evidence and good practices. And although we do have some good forum like this to exchange good practices and what works, what doesn't, what are lessons learned, but there are so many things that we still don't know about what really works to regulate political finance. And then also there are so many emerging issues like social media use as well. So yeah, I mean, we certainly devoted to conduct more in-depth research and provide data to advance this effort, but this cannot be done by single organizations or industry. So I certainly like to see more collaboration with the CSOs, media and academics and like-minded international organizations to join this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuki. Okay, this is the last intervention for the panel. In your views, the key activities that need to happen and main openings, and how should stakeholders work together?
Yeah. So I would like to recall and to remind the 4 points that we mentioned during the COSP10, the UNCAC COSP10 in Atlanta, because we made, Transparency International made a statement out there, and we were calling for 4 things. First of all, to close the regulatory loopholes that enables illicit funding, you know, for political parties, candidates, and election campaigns. So this include the enactment and enforcement of standards, of course, all of you mentioned that, but we need to ban donations from anonymous and foreign sources, that's a need, and at the same time we need to ban donations from companies that do not disclose their beneficiaries and beneficial owners. So this is also linked to the need for have beneficial owner transparency at all levels, because this has an impact on the political integrity. This is very important. Second point, to introduce compulsory system for digital reporting and disclosure of political finance information, and of course including the identity of those who give the money, because most of the time this is a missing link as well. Some will say we don't need naming and shaming, but I would say that in this era where we are, where most of the conflicts are linked to politics funded by dark money, let's name and shame. Why not? That will, you know, threaten those who want to engage in this game. Thirdly, and I want to expand on that, is the need for enforcing and giving means for oversight bodies everywhere. And fourth, promoting knowledge, civic engagement, and public participation. Once again, voters have to know, they have the right to know, and we need to empower them to do better and to pick those who matters. And in terms of collaboration, civil society, like Transparency International, we are producing a lot of data, but we need to collaborate at the same time with international organizations to exchange best practices, but also with governments. So governments need to stop seeing civil society as enemy. We are here to, you know, contribute to democracy building, and all of this knowledge that you produce is for the sake of the common good. So we need better consideration. And finally, the international institutions and donors must put additional pressure on the governments that they are funding for implementing those resolutions, agreements that they have ratified and signed. And this should be a conditionality of such loans and grants, you know. Make your politics clean through this transparency of political finance.
Thank you very much, Kay. Thank you very much to all our participants. And this is our time to open. This is your chance to make comments, to ask questions to any of our panelists. We have one question there and then one there for a start, and then we move over to this side. So if we start with these two there, do we have someone with microphones? Yes. Could you see the gentleman with the blue shirt? I think he was just ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful panel. I'm from Panama, Transparency International Panama. We just had elections, they're very interesting elections. But elections can be challenged, and some lawmakers' elections were challenged. One, particularly because the campaign cap was supposedly run over, and also they were saying that they were using government funds for local projects in order to finance the election. Now, when the election was challenged, the decision of the tribunal, the Electoral Tribunal, was that they basically said, do you have any receipts? Basically putting the burden of proof on the challenger to do that. An absurd burden of proof, because it's basically saying, can you go to your political opponent and say, give me the proof, right? Now, part of that decision was because of the own institutions' lack of confidence on their prosecutorial bodies to go after this. So my question on this is, one, well, we've talked about a little bit about strengthening the side of the oversight body, so the prosecutor side, but also what happens when the burden of proof is so heavy on the challenger, right? And if you have any, I mean, you've talked about it a bit, but like any concrete examples, or maybe civil society or journalism, heaping on that burden of proof on the challenger so that they can then have a better case in one of these funds. Like, how do they prove that they've gone over when it's so hard to track, and if they're only reporting some things and not others? So that, yeah.
Thank you very much. We had one question here in the front as well. You're there?
Yeah, thank you. Grzegorz Makowski from Poland, Stefan Wodery Foundation, Warsaw School of Economics. Maybe I haven't heard you carefully enough, but nobody spoke, I think, about state abuse of state resources for electoral campaign financing. So my question would be to you, I mean, are there any good practices how to, let's say, also monitor it, but also limit this bad practice? So this is one question. And this is also related to, one of you mentioned that there is only one global standard on let's say, proper politics financing, electoral campaign financing. But this abuse of state resources is very much related, especially in Poland, in countries like Poland, where we have many state-owned companies. And you know, many practices of bad financing are realized by the state-owned companies, and they are not illegal, you know, but they are the cases of the state abuse of state resources. And there are standards prepared by OECD on how the state-owned companies should function. But they are only at the level of good practices and recommendations. Maybe this is one way of, let's say, strengthening, enforcing good standards and putting them, I don't know, maybe in a convention. I mean, OECD can prepare a convention. So just this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have the lady in the middle here. If we can get the microphone to her, and then we'll go back. I think we'll go back to our panelists, and then we'll go back for a second round. I know there are more persons on this side.
Thank you very much. My name is Mary Awelanada. I work with the TI chapter in Ghana. I just wanted to give a little background to my question, very short one. In Ghana, the cost of elections is about $100 million to become a president. Again, we know that in our Political Parties Act, we have all the regulations set out that we are supposed to, as political parties, render accounts of expenditures after elections within 6 months, which is usually not done. and we also do not have a period capping our campaigns. And so virtually, after elections, we start the campaigning process all over again. So the $100 million is usually used, to facilitate the electioneering process. So vote buying is significantly predominant in Ghana. The electoral corruption is so rampant. We also know that there are best practices from across the globe. And so I would want the panel to share some of these with us. That if people are buying votes and they are being sanctioned somewhere, there is a process ongoing where civil society is trying to collate views and then develop a policy paper, if not a bill, to see how we can push to have better regimes in place. We believe that this process, that's why we have come, most of us are here, to listen to you, but also to shape what we have going forward. And I wanted to ask, do we have some examples of audit institutions that have been set up specifically to support the electoral management body so that they can pay attention to some of the issues of expenditure tracking? They look at issues around protecting our elections from illicit funding. In Ghana, again, we see illegal mining happening because they are funding our political parties. We see a lot of fraud happen because they are funding our political parties and getting away with them. How have these challenges been confronted in other jurisdictions where you are coming from, so that we learn and take it back home? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go back to our participants. We now have 3 questions. Burden of proof in accusation or investigations of potential violations, abuse of state resources, and addressing vote buying, addressing electoral corruption, and part of the question was also institutional body to support an election management bodies that, especially in Africa, about 40% of countries have the election management body as the political finance oversight institution. Who would like to answer any and all of these questions? Megan, please.
I can, well, maybe to start with on the abuse of state resources, I did mention it as one of the prominent problems that we see across the OSCE region, including in our observation of the recent elections in Poland, where we did note the campaigning on behalf of state enterprises and the categorize that as a misuse of state resources. What I noted about the misuse of state resources is that it's not robustly enough defined in terms of what constitutes a misuse of administrative resources, and that definition then is not understood. That line is not kept and enforced. So definitely agree that more clear and robust definition of what is misuse of resources. Just to give you a different example, in the European parliamentary elections, we also noted that some of your prominent European officials were campaigning, and we questioned whether or not that was the proper use of public office as well in there. So this lack of full understanding is needed, is a prominent problem. On the burden of proof, I mean, if we did really properly enable the oversight bodies and they had the trust and independence that they must have to properly serve this function, then the burden of proof should never be put on the complainant. It should always be, it should be detected by the oversight body, any misuse in the first place.
Just add to that,
Please.
On the 2 points. One is about the burden of proof. Of course, we do have election observers. It is their mandate and it is their job to see anything malified or corruption, money being distributed, liquor being distributed, drugs being distributed, etc. But they are part of the election commission. Now, can that change, and should that change, and when will that change? I just thought I'll mention that.
Thank you very much, Ito. Yep.
All right. I may get
Go
you, Mike.
first.
Sure, thanks, Kate. Okay. If I may try to partially answer the part of the question 2 and 3. For me, those two issues are quite related. Issues of state abuse of state resources, and then also there are multiple entities who have responsibility to control different aspects of political finance or corruption, so to say. So this is, I think, especially in the last 10 years or so, because of due to globalization or digitalizations or the other factors we live in, it becomes clear that political finance regulations alone probably do not efficiently address the risk of money in politics, unfortunately. Therefore, we certainly advocate more whole of society, sort of whole of a government approach to it, meaning that we need to mainstream political finance in a more broader anti-corruption frameworks and make more specific links and then connection between political finance, for example, and public procurement, for example, or political finance and lobbying, or political finance and beneficiary ownership, for example. And when those data are finally available and then be able to cross-check, then we could finally have a sort of broader picture of the flow in money in politics. So for that, we also think, because going back to the global standard too, currently I think political finance is very much treated in a very siloed manner, and we certainly want to see it be scaled up. And then very glad to hear that OECD recommendations are also being used and state enterprises, and also they have numerous very good recommendations on public integrity as well. But political finance needs to be brought out in a more prominent way, I think. And then in terms of the oversight bodies and the mode of regulations, as Magnus roughly talked about, I don't think there's a global one-fits-all regulatory model, so to say. In some countries, electoral management bodies have a responsibility to conduct oversight, but in other countries, for example, anti-corruption agencies have that mandate. And then because the very nature of that institute, they have a lot more stronger sort of investigative powers. They could confiscate the evidence and then seize all the assets and things like that. But whereas in other countries, the responsibility lies with ministries, for example. So what's important is, I think, this inter-agency cooperation here. One agencies can possibly not be able to do this, but if the government is somehow introduce a better coordination mechanism and information sharing and regular sort of sharing of information and intels, I mean, that should be, political finance should be better regulated.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, so when I listen to what Mary from Ghana says, I can relate because we just had, presidential elections last year in Madagascar and legislatives 2 weeks ago. So it's totally the same scheme, like big money rules. And there is nothing really which is happening against that from the government perspective, because there is a state capture scheme and all the electoral bodies are captured by the presidential party. It's difficult, very difficult in that kind of scenario for civil society to fight against this like institutionalized corruption. But there is one thing that you mentioned, the big expenses made in campaigns, that made me think that, yes, that reminded me the fact that we need to cap electoral spending. This is one of the ways, I would say, to regulate political finance. And we need to advocate for that, because not only it does increase the equality of chances of political runners and competitors, but at the same time it reduces the need for politicians to look for dark funding in order to compete with those who have big money. Because we know that those dark funding, such as the Russian influence in Malagasy elections in 2018, for instance, and elsewhere, it was not just in Madagascar, have tremendous consequence on the management of natural resources. All of this is linked, also on vote buy-in and everything. So the fate of a country is biased by this dark political finance. That's why we really need to start by capping these expenses. And one of the things that I wanted to mention also is that there is this, like a run for the escalation in expenses. We really need to fight against that, of course, but at the same time, we need strong sanctions once again, and I wanted to emphasize that from the international side, because when the electoral observers come into place, the common statement is fair and free elections, while, as our colleague from Panama said, there is an overload of evidence from civil society of irregularities. Why do international observers don't dare to take those evidence and, to claim and to put pressure on the government saying, we partly funded your elections and now we have evidence that they have been rigged. This is a sanction, or do this. Enough complicit statements. We don't need those. We need action to tackle political, misbehavior, I would say. And we don't have to be ashamed of the word political corruption. Most of the time we don't say that. We always speak about only dark political finance, whatever, but this is political corruption. And they should be written somewhere also in all our conventions, because this is ruining our world, our democracies, everything.
Thank you. Ina, do you want to comment on that? No? Okay. So let me move on. I just want to make a quick comment on Ghana, which also relates to abuse of state resources we were talking about. In Ghana, we've had a changeover of power since 1992 between the political parties back and forth. And that we expect then to see a reduction of the abuse of state resources over time. But we haven't seen that in Ghana, and it is disappointing. And we have a lot of work left to do. We're going to move over to this side. We had one question here, and then question over here, and then we may not have time for more than that, I'm afraid. But if we start with the lady in blue here in the...
Hello, my name is Anne Tolley. I'm the chair of Transparency International in New Zealand. New Zealand has significant regulations and rules around election campaigns and finance, and yet people still mistrust and are calling for state funding of election campaigns. And I'm interested in the views of the panel. If we get rid of private funding altogether, do we then enable a different type of political finance corruption?
Thank you very much. And the gentleman?
It was first here and then back.
Okay, so we have over there, and then the final question from in the front. I'm sorry, the lights means I can't see everyone.
Well, we could probably continue another hour or so, but I'll be quick. I'm Ulrich Åserbrand, Secretary General of Transparency International Sweden. Sweden being neighboring country to Norway, this was for Björg as well to respond to possibly. We have a similar legislation as Norway. We have similar digital tools, yet we failed miserably in Sweden 2 years ago because of a party funding scandal. Basically, anonymous donations are not, you cannot give them very fractional sums. But 5 out of 8 parties in Sweden were willing to receive 50,000 euros each anonymously. Now, the question is there, why did that happen? 2 years before that, we had said we need to evaluate the legislation. We don't think it works in practice. Could you circumvent it? All those 5 out of 8 parties, parliamentary parties, if it had been 1, it would have been bad. But 5 shows the situation about political integrity as such, at heart. Now, my question is, how would you be able to deter that? We do have a legislation. It's actually not allowed. Is it a matter of sanctions? And the next question goes to Björg as well, is if this had happened in Norway, what would have happened? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have a final question here at the front.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Julien Courson. I'm from TI Lebanon. So we're thank you first for a very insightful discussion. We're currently reviewing the 2 chapters under the legislative election law tackling campaign finance, but also, and this is related to my question, so the review, our ambition is to amend the law, obviously. But there is, I think, an aspect related to the role of media in campaign finance. So media as a recipient of funding, of money from the candidates. So I would like to hear from the experts, what are the best practices in that regard? How to best regulate this component, how to monitor it, and how can transparency be strengthened in that perspective? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can address one more question. We'll need to have brief answers now. Please, the gentleman here in front.
Thank you. It appears you have civil society speaking and you don't want to listen to politicians and women. Let me be blunt with you. Politics, like religion, has sovereignty. No global system is going to sort that out. No laws set up under UNCAC or anything else. It depends on the fabric of the society, the ambitions of and the aspirations of our voters. I am standing in front of you, sir, as a 4th-term member of parliament. I am not an African. I'm a different color. I have been heading an African 100% constituency for now 20 years. I am an independent member of parliament, and we do not have political funding. The situation is very clear, as you said, 2024. In India, in Pakistan, in South Africa, and other places, the people are rising. And as much as you want to put in, and we have political funding systems as well, they don't work. And unless you are putting institutions that are beyond reproach, be it the anti-corruption or whatever, beyond reproach, it's not going to work. In Kenya, our elections, our government were decided by less than 200,000 votes. Less than. The 5 million versus 5 million. The decision was made by the Americans and the British. They made the decisions. What about that sort of political corruption that we're talking about? But I want to tell you one thing, sir. And the question is, what about political interference? And the question really depends upon where do the voters stand. Yeah? And be a little bit cautious. We've listened to you, civil society, for a long time. Just listen to us. We don't mind. I've also paid good money to come here and to share with you the experiences that we have. And that's what we're doing here, sharing the experiences. By the way, I'm the chairman of the African Parliamentarians Against Corruption. And we do know what we're saying. So as what you are saying this, you must also be able to temper the approach. UNCAC 7, whatever else, it's very nice to speak about. Nothing is implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will simply unfortunately, I would love to continue the discussion for another couple of days, but we will be kicked out of this room in a little while because there's another panel in which I'm talking, so if anyone wants to stay. But I'll open to our participants. Who wants to respond? State Secretary?
Thank you. Since I got a direct question, I thought I could use that to also say that there's no reason for any one of us to be complacent. And to the last speaker as well, that implementation and follow-up of these good intentions does depend on the makeup of, or you said the fabric of the voters in the country, and that's the same for all of us. So which means it's important for all of us to make sure that we do take our international commitments seriously and try to heed them, and that is the case in Norway as well. And to address the question from my colleague from Sweden, I think our two countries are quite similar, and one of the reasons why the system has functioned until now, this is a personal reflection, is that there's been a kind of balance of terror between the parties. So if all parties observe the same rules of transparency, we've been able to preserve the integrity of the system. Our system was also tested in the last election, where a named individual collected anonymous donations, at least anonymous to the rest of us, and offered this money to parties to see who would take it. There was one party that would have accepted to take this money. It was not illegal, because there was a named individual offering an amount of money, but it was well known that that money had been collected from sources that could have been illegal, as they were anonymous, which is illegal, and could have been foreign, which is also illegal. And yes, there was a party willing to accept that money. So none of us have any reason to be complacent, and we all need to continue preserving the integrity of our electoral financing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Secretary. I'm getting very strict signals from our organizers that we need to end. Anyone wants to say last 30 seconds?
I can say just 30 seconds on the public funding option. Solely public funding does prevent a lot of benefits, but also has a lot of risks for small and new upcoming parties. But in terms of accountability of the funds, it's a lot of benefits. On thresholds, I just want to reiterate that in the OSCE region, a certain threshold for anonymous donations is necessary so that those can feel free to donate to parties. And media, I 100% agree that the use of public funds in the campaign or use of party financing distorts the media advertisement market, and the use of the monopolization of ownership of media by certain parties also, it contributes to their funding of their campaign.
20 seconds.
Yeah, on state funding, yes, we've had many committees that look into the issue of state funding. I'm aware that many countries, especially those in Europe, are going into the process of state funding. But in India, the discussion is whether it will put a burden on the taxpayer, and the benchmark for taxpayers in India is already very low. On the media, the only place where we do have equitable distribution pre-election is for the state-owned media, that is television and All India Radio. But now the campaigns are entirely run on social media, and how do you monitor and curb that? Thank you
very much. And I'm afraid
Just 10 seconds.
10 seconds.
For the politician, it's also your role to educate your peers to the culture of ethics and transparency, so do it. Thank you.
That was right. Okay. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you all for your participation in this session. I encourage you all to support the work on increasing transparency and control in political finance, and to lend your hand for the push for a blueprint for reform the State Secretary and Chair mentioned. In this case, the first ever UNCAC resolution on political finance for the next COSP. Thank you very much.